All right, start of our sermon here, Grounded, Part 4. We're going through our 8 statements of faith as a church, and we're not taking 8 weeks to do it. Last week I covered 3, but this week and next week I'm going to spend 2 weeks on statement number 6, and you'll see why in just a moment, okay? Statement number 6 for our church says this: God created the human race, both male and female, in his own image. We believe, therefore, so this is our statement as a church family, we believe, therefore, in the sanctity of all human life from conception to natural death, and that marriage is intended by God to be between one man and one woman. So the first part of this statement, that God created everybody, male and female, in his image. And we believe in the sanctity of all human life from conception to death. What does that mean, sanctity of life? What does that mean, God's image? That means we believe every human being. And when we say every, we mean every human being. Not just unborn babies, but it includes them. Not just, but it doesn't matter whether it be disability or race or beliefs or even sinful lifestyle or sinful choices. We believe all human beings are made in God's image. And we believe in the sanctity of life, not just for unborn and elderly and stuff. We believe in the sanctity of life for all human beings. That means every person is worthy. Just by the fact of existing and being a person, every person is worthy of being treated with dignity and respect and of protection of their life. Now, of course, with a statement like this, a lot of people go right away to, okay, this is going to be a sermon about abortion, okay? And you're right, but as often happens at Crossview, we're going to hit abortion from some angles, I think, that are a little different than they're often hit from. And one of the things I want to start by talking about is this issue of, in our society, how it's so hard to have a discussion in so many areas without things getting superheated and polarized. And that certainly includes the discussion over abortion. And so Christians who are pro-life like ourselves, we are oftentimes guilty of calling people who disagree with us, people who believe that abortion should be permitted, name calling things like murderers. It's all about death and murder and all that sort of stuff. And then on the other side, people who are in favor of abortion being permitted will sometimes call Christians who are pro-life, and they'll say they're anti-women and they're anti-choice. And all of this name-calling, one of the things we need to get good at is, even in a discussion over things that we feel passionate about, we actually need, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, it actually matters that we follow in the way of Jesus, right? So how do we engage in discussions like this? And that's what the first part of this sermon is all about, is how do we engage as Christians, people who follow Jesus? How do we engage in this? And so if we go back to that statement, I want to look at it one more time. God created the human race, both male and female, in his image. We believe, therefore, in the sanctity of all human life. One of the first things that we have to remind ourselves is that all human beings includes those people who disagree with us. Isn't that true? Like, we become hypocrites the moment we go, it's all about the unborn baby, and now we attack the people who disagree with us. We become immediately hypocrites, because this isn't just about unborn babies. If we're going to be pro-life, we have to be pro-all life. And that means treating people who disagree with us with respect and dignity. And there's another principle at work here that's straight from the mouth of Jesus. It's called the Golden Rule. And it's from Matthew chapter 7. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew 7. So in everything, the Greek word there translated everything means everything. Now there's a whole bunch of things that are included under everything. Like everything. So that includes the abortion debate, debates about COVID and vaccine status and LGBTQ issues and all these things. All of it is included under the heading everything. In everything, if we could put that verse back up there, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. That's the golden rule, Matthew 7, verse 12. So in everything, we are to treat the people who disagree with us the way we would want to be treated. And so you know what the first thing that means? Whether it be a discussion about LGBTQ issues, or whether it be a discussion about abortion issues, or whether it be a discussion about COVID, or any of these hot button kind of topics, it means that what we call the people who disagree with us, we have to use the golden rule, means if I don't want them, so if I'm in a discussion with someone who's in favor of abortion, do I want them to call me anti-woman or anti-choice? And the answer is no. I want them to call me by the name that I like to think of my position, which is pro-life. But guess what? If I want them to do that for me, that means I have to do that for them. That means I don't just get to say, hey, you're a murderer and you're in favor of death. And they say we want to be called pro-choice. And Christians go, yeah, but it's not about choice. It's about, whoa. It's actually about the golden rule. I want them to call me by a respectful name that respects my position. I need to actually do the same to them. Isn't that true? That's covered under in everything. The golden rule. And by the way, if we're actually to stop and think about things, practically speaking, where has all the name calling and outrage gotten us anyway? It's been very effective, hasn't it? Sarcasm for those of you online. Here's something I want to say that might feel weird. What a weird thing to say in church. Did you know that many of the people who disagree with us, many of the people who believe that abortion should be permitted are actually compassionate, wonderful people? Did you know that? You're like, what? No, they're not. See, the fact that this is what happens when we cease to become like Jesus. You label another group of people, and once you label them, it's like they're not human. You can pretend that they're evil and ignorant and all these sorts of things. But the fact of the matter is, you know what? Probably about 77%, these are what the stats tell us, about 77% of people in Canada are in favor of permitting abortion in at least some circumstances. Okay? Let me tell you something. Unless you never get out of church, I personally know some people who are wonderful, loving, compassionate people. They wouldn't hurt a flea, and they're actually in favor of abortion being permitted. You say, why are you telling us this? Why would you say such things? By calling them nice, are you saying that you agree with them? And that's exactly my point. This is where, as Christians, I feel like sometimes we have the emotional range of a penny. I got that off the Harry Potter reunion special, by the way. I just shouldn't really... or out of one of the movies. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Now I'm being heavily judged. We have this tiny emotional range whereby if I disagree with you, it means you must be a bad person. Wait a minute, it has nothing to do with it. If we're going to walk in the way of Jesus and the golden rule, we actually have to, it's 77% of Canada is not a bunch of evil monsters. And unless you have absolutely no contacts in your family or friends or neighbors or work who are believers, you have no contacts outside of that, you know people, and many of them are compassionate, wonderful people, who are in favor of abortion. Now, does that mean I agree with them? No, not at all. And I actually think being pro-life, and we're going to bring that to the surface the rest of this sermon and then next week. I think pro-life is a beautiful position, but it means that we have to engage in this in a thoughtful, compassionate way that invites conversation and relationship, kind of like Jesus. So let's start with a little thought experiment, because I like thought experiments. And this particular thought experiment is one that in this debate comes up fairly regularly. I've seen it on social media. I've heard it personally in conversations with people I know. I've read it in newspaper articles. And it's a thought experiment usually posed by people from the pro-choice side who are in favor of permitting abortion. And here's how the thought experiment goes. The question will be asked, usually to a Christian person, a pro-life person, the question will be asked, imagine there's a building. This is a thought experiment. So imagine there's a building with 2 rooms. And in one room, you have this cute little 5-year-old boy. And in the other room, you have 1,000 test tubes and in those test tubes are little tiny baby embryos. So you have 1,000 embryos in one room in test tubes. And then you have this cute little 5-year-old boy in this other room. And there's a fire in the building, and it's a thought experiment. And so you're only able to save one room. You can either save the 5-year-old boy, or you can save the 1,000 embryos. Which one do you save? And the moment this question gets posed to Christians get very uncomfortable because you can kind of see where this is going, right? Because if you're pro-life, you feel this pressure of like, well, I guess if it's 1,000 to 1, I guess I need to save the embryos. But the moment you say you'll save the embryos, people go like, what? You're going to save the test tubes? You're not going to save the 5-year-old kid. And some of you are going, so what's the right answer? Right? Some of you have heard this. I wonder how many of you have heard this or read this one or seen this or had this conversation already. Well, let me tell you what I would say and what most Christian ethicists would say. And let's make this even easier for ourselves by saying, imagine it's your 5-year-old son or daughter. And I'll tell you right now who I would save. I saved the 5-year-old kid. And you say, oh, but wait a minute, that plays into the hands of the debate because you've just told the pro-choice person, the person who's in favor of permitting abortion, you've just told them that you agree with them that a 5-year-old child is more of a person than an embryo, and therefore it's okay to abort an unborn embryo. So I'm going to put these statements up on that PowerPoint, and we're just going to work this out, okay? So, and I've put check marks and X's there so that nobody misunderstands here or at home what I'm saying. I could see myself getting some kind of angry email. I don't agree with this argument, okay? But here's how the reasoning goes. A 5-year-old child and an embryo are different. We agree on that, actually. They are different in some intrinsic way because the reason I go to the 5-year-old and save the 5-year-old is that 5-year-old has the ability to feel pain, has memories, relationships. And so in this extreme situation where I only have a chance to save one, yes, I choose the one who feels terror, who could feel horrific pain, who I perhaps have a relationship with. I do choose that one, and many Christian ethicists would agree with me, and probably most people in that situation would agree with me in this extreme situation. But where the faulty logic comes in is to say next, well, therefore, an embryo in its initial stages of development is not a person. Therefore, it is morally permissible to abort an embryo if we choose. This actually does not follow from number one. And let me change the thought experiment for just a moment so that we can see that. Imagine if in your 2 rooms, instead of having a small son, your son or daughter and 1,000 embryos and 2 test tubes, imagine if you had, if your 5-year-old, a son or daughter in one room, and then in the other room, you have a great-grandparent. And maybe this great-grandparent has even Alzheimer's or dementia or terminal cancer or something, even to make it even a little bit easier. Still horrific. We go into this horrific thought experiment again. There's a fire, and you can only save one. Which one do you choose? Well, again, it's a horrible situation to think about. We don't want to think about it, but probably most of us in that moment end up saving the child. Why? Is it because you think the elderly person is not human and not worthy of dignity and we should just be allowed to kill them whenever we want? No, not at all. The point is you've been put into an extreme situation where you can only save one. And so there's other factors that might come into it, like this person still has this little kid still has their whole life to live. This one's at the end. I love them both, but I choose this one because it's such an extreme situation. It's a thought experiment. But just because you chose that one in the extreme thought experiment does not mean that you think elderly people or people who struggle with Alzheimer's or dementia are not people worthy of life? If you could, you would do whatever you could to save both. Isn't that true? You would do your best to save both. And you think both are worthy of life and dignity and love. It's just this thought experiment has put you in a place where you have to choose one or the other. So when we choose the child over embryos in a test tube, we're not saying it's the same as a pregnant mom. Imagine a mom who has a 10-year-old daughter, and then she gets pregnant for a second time, and she's so excited to be pregnant, but then she's forced to choose between her unborn child and the daughter. Well, probably you choose the daughter, but it's not because you don't love this unborn child within you. It's just an extreme choice. And that's really important. We agree that there is a difference between an embryo and a 5-year-old child, or a 5-year-old child and a senior person, but they're actually all human beings, and they're all worthy of love and life and defending. Well, let's switch gears again. Being pro-life means being compassionate, but what I'm going to say next is really important. Moving on from the thought experiment. But if we're going to be pro-life, we need to actually be consistent in our pro-life stance. We need to actually be consistent in our pro-life stance. Because if we only care about unborn babies, and sometimes the outside world starts to think that evangelical Christians are pro-life means only unborn babies, but it doesn't mean indigenous people or refugees or people in countries with things our country needs for resources or whatever, or people we don't agree with their lifestyle or whatever. Being pro-life means being pro-all life. But when as Christians we are only pro-life, by that we mean only unborn babies, it starts to look more like we care about politics than we actually do about the dignity of all human beings. Because have you ever noticed how in church there's certain code words? I know this as a pastor very well. There's certain code words and code issues. If I bring up those code words and code issues, everybody in church feels comfortable. But if I bring up other code words and other code issues, so if I bring up unborn babies and being pro-life in a church, everybody goes, this is a good church. But if I bring up indigenous people, some of the people go, what kind of a liberal, kind of weird, left-leaning, right? Why is that? Because in our culture, some of these issues have become politicized. So conservatives tend to think about these groups of people, and liberals tend to think about these kinds of people. Guess what? If you follow Jesus, we have to transcend conservative and liberal. We have to care about all. And if we aren't consistent in being pro-all life, we actually, as Christians, lose our moral authority in society. Because society says, you're not actually pro-life, you're pro this issue. You're not actually pro-life, you're pro this issue. But when Jesus came to earth, he's the one who, and we'll say, yeah, but it's people's choices, right? Wait a minute. Isn't Jesus the one who refused to condemn prostitutes? They're making choices. Isn't Jesus the one that came and invited tax collectors into his inner discipleship circle? Isn't Jesus the one who hugged lepers? Isn't Jesus the one who, hanging on the cross, forgave the very people, the soldiers who were torturing him? We have a very high pro-life calling if we're going to call ourselves Christians. Just to take a little rabbit trail, and then we're going to come back to this issue. Christian history is a lot messier than we as Christians generally like to remember or think about or say. As Christians, usually when we're in church, we like to celebrate all of our Christian successes throughout history. But we don't like to think about huge swaths of history. Like where Europeans who were mostly Christians as settlers and explorers coming into North America committed actually many acts of genocide and oppression and slavery against indigenous populations. And many of them did it as fully Christian people, sometimes in the name of Christianity. But we don't like to talk about those things because it's like, well, that's in the past. We didn't do that. It wasn't me that did that. But isn't there such a principle as reaping and sowing? Isn't that in our Bibles? If you reap something, or if you sow something, you will reap something. Do we actually think that if the people who settled this country sowed in violence and oppression and all these sorts of things for centuries, that we would not also have to reap some of these things for centuries? Galatians 6 verse 7 says this, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, and so does a nation, and so does history." So as Christians who are following Jesus, the one who embraced lepers and called in tax collectors and refused to condemn prostitutes, we have a higher calling than just to have this attitude of get over it, it wasn't me. That actually doesn't fly for a Christ GN. We have a higher calling to enter in to the reaping that's happening in our societies and the reaping that's happening from society, and to enter in the name of Christ with love and with empathy. And as we do that in all areas of society, we get our moral authority back to also be able to say, and we also stand for the life and the lives of the unborn. And so we come back to the issue of abortion. We can't just be for unborn babies. We have to also be for women and for moms, the vulnerable. We have to care about the issues that cause women to get abortions in the first place, shouldn't we? Isn't that true? You know, one of the things Susan Penner said to me from Life Culture here in town, great organization. I'll mention a little bit more of that in the practical element of this message right at the end. But one of the things that she said to me last year that really hit home with me is she said, you know, Kris, abortion isn't a desired outcome for anybody, even people on the pro-choice, permitting abortion side. I never thought of that before. I'd always just kind of assumed if you're in favor of abortion, the more abortions, the better. But then I actually started to think about it. No girl grows up thinking, I want to get an abortion. Nobody celebrates, oh, yes, I get my abortion today. There's actually more overlap. Did you know, and the reason this is important, and we'll talk a bit more about this next week, there's actually more overlap between pro-life in many of the compassionate, thoughtful people on the pro-choice side than we sometimes give credit for. And I think there's a lot of room in there for us to discuss and do things that might actually reduce abortions in our country. But think about it this way. An abortion is nothing like a hernia. Okay? It's nothing like a hernia. But let me just make this comparison for just a moment. For those of you who've had a hernia ever, and hernia surgery, I have. Okay? It's just not fun. Now, I'm glad, again, there's some parallels here, there's some not. So I'm not comparing hernia surgery and abortion, but there's an element of this. I'm glad that there are hospitals that if I get another hernia, I can go there and get a hernia surgery. But this isn't a life goal of mine. On the day of my hernia surgery, I did not wake up going, oh, yay, I get hernia surgery today. In the same way, you have to understand that having an abortion is not something people are wanting to have. They're not looking forward to have. They're not planning, I want to have an abortion. And this is really important because then that makes us ask the question, well, why would a woman get an abortion? Okay? And many studies have been done about this, and there's many complicated reasons, and the studies actually tell us that most women who end up getting an abortion have multiple reasons that tie into why they got an abortion. But if we're going to really just oversimplify a whole massive amount of studies and a whole massive amount of work, we're going to realize that the vast majority of women who get an abortion, it basically boils down to they are terrified that they're not going to be able to take care of this baby, and for a whole host of reasons, could be financial, emotional, relational. Almost none of these women are married or in a committed relationship. Often, the guy who played a role in this whole thing is not supportive and isn't wanting to take care of the baby. And now you have this, what is predominantly often many young women who are in a place of fear, and they're afraid, and they go and they get an abortion. Now, here's the thing. How can we call ourselves pro-life if all we do is hold up signs and tell the government to outlaw abortion, but we don't care about taking care of these women and the reasons why they might want to have an abortion? Isn't that true? And if you actually talk to many of the people who are in favor of abortion, you'll find that they're not raving lunatics. They actually often come at it from a place of compassion, and they'll say to you something like this: who is suffering more, the unborn baby who is aborted or the unwanted child who gets born into a terrible situation and gets raised in a situation where they're not wanted or they're not loved or they're sent into a foster home or whatever, some of the terrible situations that these kids get born into. Now again, I believe we hurt the soul of our society when we take the lives of the unborn or the elderly. But until we understand that there's also a cost to pay when unwanted children also suffer, we're not going to be able to become truly pro-life where we care about all the lives, not just before they're born, but also after they're born. If we're going to be truly pro-life, we need to stand not just for the rights of the unborn, but the afterborn. I came up with that this morning. I thought it was good. We're going to have to stand for the rights not just of the unborn, but also for the rights of women. Being pro-life is so much bigger than just being against abortion. And so what we truly desire as a church and as the people of God is to be part of creating a culture of life. What is a culture of life? A culture of life is a place where churches and families and communities and government, because no one of those things, by the way, the church will never be able to do everything. And the government isn't all evil, contrary to what some Christians think. The government is sometimes inept. By the way, so are churches. I mean, shoot, I just don't get written about in the newspaper. Hopefully. That's a bad day if I do, probably. I mean, we're just inept humans. The government's inept, churches are inept, businesses are often inept. It just happens. Okay, fine. What are we going to do about it? But when government and churches and communities come together to create a culture of life, what does that mean, culture of life? Okay, well, think about this. Think about what are some of the reasons that put pressure on these young women that they would want to have an abortion in the first place? Well, they're afraid. Maybe they're having a hard time making ends meet already, and now they're afraid of losing their job. How am I going to work now that I'm pregnant? How am I going to work now that I'm a mom? Well, culture of life comes down to could be some of the most practical things you ever thought about. It's not just standing against abortion, even though that is a slice of it. But what if there was a culture of life that was created in a business community? This is just one example. Where moms, I've been in conversations with leaders, and they're not bad people. They're wonderful people. It's the way things just are right now. But I've been in multiple conversations over the years with really good people. They weren't meaning bad. But leaders in business and organizations who have said things to me like, I have the opportunity to hire a young woman who is gifted, talented, skilled. She'd be awesome. Or I have this guy who's a bit of a dud. Okay? But I know she's going to end up getting married. She's pretty probably. She's smart. She's going to get married, and then she's going to get pregnant. So they hire the dud. I get it. They're not evil. They're just trying to survive in business, right? But do you see the kind of pressure that creates on women? And now you have women are afraid to get pregnant because it's like, well, I know I'm going to lose my job. I'm at a disadvantage. What if a culture of life includes everything? Could you imagine a culture of life where businesses were encouraged and supported each other? Because do you know that moms have a lot to give? Like how many of you, and some of you dads are here beside your wife, so you better just agree with this, okay? But how many of you, like I married up, my wife can pull off stuff. And do you know how many organizations are missing out from some of these high-capacity women because they're like, nope, it's an 8 to 5. She's got to be here 9 hours a day. It's like, if you gave her just a little bit of flexibility, wait till after the kids go to school, now come in. If you just let her do a little bit of her work at home, if you create a little bit of flexibility, you would get twice as much out of that mom as you will out of 2 guys. Amen? It's true. It's just absolutely true. What if we a culture of life is not just being anti-abortion, it's creating a culture in business, in work, in a community where women and the vulnerable and unwanted children are supported and where there's not this fear of loss. And as we do that, and that's just one tiny little example, but as we do that, as Christians, as we stand for these sorts of things consistently, we will gain our moral authority to then also be able to say to our culture, and we stand for the unborn. Something bad happens to the soul of a nation when we take the lives of our most vulnerable. But we're not just standing here to say what we're against. We're actually, as a church, here to say what we're standing for. We are for government programs and ministries and missions that minister to the vulnerable and to families and to women and all those sorts of things. We are pro all life. Practical. One practical. We're going to come back at this next week. I want to talk a little bit about medically assisted dying and dignity and the church's role in that. And a little bit more about this as well. But one of the organizations in our community that we are so proud to support here at Crossview is Life's Culture. It's right here. You can check out their website. We were recording our first services at Crossview from their offices. And I volunteer on their board. So, we need people to volunteer here at Crossview to make Crossview happen. But it's a bit hypocritical of me to ask you guys to volunteer here, but I don't volunteer anywhere outside of Crossview, so that's some of my volunteer. But anyway, guys, can you put that back up? It looks better than me anyway. Yeah, there we go. Isn't that cute? I was going to say something that would get me in trouble, so I'm just going to stop. Okay. But you can check out their website. Send Susan, that's their director, and she comes to church here, and John, her husband, is on our board, but they have tons of practical ideas and things that they're doing, practical things in the community, programs and education to help women, what it means to create a culture of life in a community, and awesome ministry, awesome organization. And the more I think we can learn about those things as a church and as Christians, I think is amazing. So I want you to bow your heads with me, and I want you to close your eyes. Father in heaven, I feel like in many ways we have, as Christians in our country, given up our moral authority. We stand for some important issues, but because of our lack of standing on other issues, we've lost our moral authority to talk on those ones. Forgive us for that. Forgive me for that. Father, we want to be known as a people. You embraced Samaritans, you embraced lepers, prostitutes, tax collectors. That has got to be what we are like here at Crossview and as a church here in Steinbach. Help us to become that and to be effective in that and to get our moral authority back, to speak as people who are not just political, but who are actual Christians, that all human life is worthy of dignity and love. In Jesus' name we pray. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen.